Welcome back to Throwback Thursday, where each and every week we take a slightly closer look at the more interesting items in our ever-growing park cameras used department. Now this week, we're doing macro photography, and specifically macro photography with a Micro Four Thirds system. Now, I've done macro photography in the past. I've actually was particularly fascinated with it for a while, but I've tended to use full frame system, and that tends to be what I've used for all the macro photography I've ever really done. So researching this video and kind of researching the pros and the cons and stuff like that, and then actually going out and shooting with a Micro Four Thirds system for macro photography has been very, very interesting, because there's a number of reasons this has been a very fun way to shoot macro photography. So the setup, let's talk about what I've got. So I've rated out used department as usual for these videos. I've got the Panasonic Lumix G80 for my camera, for the actual body. That's a Micro Four Thirds system. And then the lens I've gone for is the Panasonic Leica 45mm f 2.8 macro lens. Now that means that on a camera like this with the smaller Micro Four Thirds sensor, I'm getting a crop factor of ×2, which essentially means that it's a 45mm lens. It's giving me the equivalent focal length of 90mm, which is important because that's a great focal length for macro photography. Now that's really nice and close, really makes it easy to get in nice and close to your subject. Now I've had two shoots using this system, one in a more controlled environment where I had lighting set up, it was completely still subjects, there was no wind, it was all indoors. I was able to be basically completely in control of the shoot and the setup. And then the second one was out and about. So taking this out handheld, out into the woods, out in general sort of areas, and just finding interesting subjects for macro photography. So obviously having significantly less control, I'd say verging on no control over what I was going to find, the light, and basically just having to use the settings of the camera to actually take the photographs. And having those two shoots meant I was really able to test out how this camera was, because macro photography is such a potentially broad subject where you could set up a little studio setting with lights and everything, and that's a very different situation to going out into the woods and finding bugs and interesting textures and stuff like that to take macro photos of, where you have no control. So it's interesting to be able to test this out with both of those kind of styles in mind. Now, what I should mention, if you want to learn more about macro photography itself, if you're interested in learning how it works, some tips and tricks and stuff like that, we will have a Tutorial Tuesday video coming out soon about specifically macro photography, the best things to do, the best way to get photos and things like that. So keep an eye out for that. Today, we're going to be talking about why you might be using Micro Four Thirds in particular. So let's talk about some of the advantages that using a Micro Four Thirds system for macro photography brings. Now, it's important to say up front that it's totally possible to get great macro shots with pretty much any format of camera. So full frame obviously is a really nice way of taking photos, and even up to medium format and large format cameras, of course, gives you loads of rich detail. But even down to like compact camera, 1-inch sensor cameras, you can get some great macro shots. And even with those much smaller sensor cameras like that, actually there are some advantages there with extended depth of field and stuff like that. So it's definitely possible to get that. But try it out with Micro Four Thirds. I feel there's actually a huge number of advantages while still retaining a lot of the advantages of things like a full frame camera. Micro Four Thirds cameras offer you the exposure control and the resolving power and generally the kind of versatility and control you'd get from larger format cameras like a full frame camera, but with the extended depth of field that you get from having a smaller sensor camera. And that's important in macro photography because one of the biggest hurdles when taking macro photos is depth of field. You know, getting everything that you want to be in focus. You want to have that creative decision. You know, if you want to have a bumblebee with just the head in focus and everything else is blurred out, absolutely, that's going to look awesome. But what you don't want is to have that forced upon you. You don't want to have just a very, very razor thin focal plane. And when you get in really close to subjects, which you tend to do with macro photography, that can be forced upon you. So having the extended depth of field that you get from having a smaller sensor is a big, big plus. So for example, if you use f8 on this lens here, then you're going to be getting the equivalent depth of field of using something like f16 on a full frame camera. And that's because it is a smaller sensor, you're getting a much shallower depth of field. Now, normally, if you're taking portraits and stuff like that, that would be frustrating because depth of field looks lovely. You know, a shallow depth of field looks super awesome. But as I mentioned before, in macro photography, it's too much. So having the ability to control that even more so here, helps a lot. Another huge advantage when it comes to using a Micro Four Thirds system like this for macro is there's just the size and weight of the system. I mean, look at this. It is almost, effortless to just hold this. It's tiny. I didn't even need a camera bag to go out and take photos using this. And look at the lens, it's so small, and yet it's a 45mm f2.8, essentially a 90mm f2.8. The size and weight of this lens means I could probably get 3 lenses in a bag before I'm even coming close to a full-sized, full-frame lens. Some of those bigger lenses, they can be really quite large and weighty, whereas this is almost nothing. And it meant that I didn't have to take a bag when I went out into the woods. I was able to just have a nice stroll around the woods, taking photos. I had a sense of freedom that I don't have with bigger cameras, and it freed me up to just concentrate on the photography side of things. It also means that shooting handheld is actually really pleasant because I'm not holding up an incredibly heavy system or having to think about how big things are and things like that. Added onto that is, of course, the image stabilization in this camera as well. Now, that is a feature of a lot of mirrorless cameras, but having it in here, again, just emphasizes being able to shoot handheld. So all of the shots of things like the grapes, the apple, out and about with the moss and stuff like that, that's all just handheld. And I was able to do that because of the image stabilization of the camera. It meant that I could stop down my aperture, so I could get a deeper depth of field, but I could still use relatively a slower shutter speed to let more light in without having to go crazy on the ISO, that was my concern with shooting handheld. And I was able to do that. I was able to have that slower shutter speed without having the camera shake, without having the hand shake, because of the IS. It made a massive, massive difference. And combining that with the size of this just makes it a really, really nice handheld system. Now, one of the slight downsides of a Micro Four Thirds system over something like full frame is the resolution. It is going to be lower. Now, we're not talking anything crazy here. This is a 16 megapixel camera, but it does mean you don't have quite as much room in post for things like cropping. There's just not as much resolution to play around with. That's still a really decent sized image, and I was still able to get it exactly how I wanted, but it just made me think about composing my image properly at the time. You can't rely on recomposing it in post, reframing things as much. You've still got a little bit of room, but there's just not as much there, as opposed to, full frame cameras tend to start sort of the mid-20s for megapixel count. So you've just got a bit more resolution there to play with. Now, like I said, again, it's not a massive downside because as long as you're just concentrating on the photography, as long as you're getting right in camera, probably isn't really going to affect you at all. And actually, for me, that just made me think more about what I was doing. I would just take an extra few seconds to compose the shot, and that's actually a really good thing. That's a good habit to get into anyway. Another big advantage of a Micro Four Thirds system is the price. Now, that's not one I like to talk about that much because it's kind of more of a reality of things rather than a really interesting thing. But the price of a Micro Four Thirds system is significantly cheaper, generally speaking, than a full frame system. I mean, this is the Panasonic G80 used, that's coming in at $379, and the lens, the 45mm f2.8, that's $349. So I'll pop links down to these in the description so you can check them out for yourselves, and the whole used department, there's loads of cool stuff in there, so it's definitely worth a look. But that means for just over £700, you've got an incredibly good macro system here, which can also double up for portraits as well, giving you an effective focal length of 90mm, great for portraits, f2.8, nice bit of depth of field. You're gonna have a great system. So anyone who's kind of coming into this from maybe they do macro shots on their phone, or maybe they're getting into macro photography but they don't know where to start, what to get. I would absolutely, after shooting with this for a couple of days, I'd absolutely recommend a Micro Four Thirds system, something like this. It's small, it's easy to use, it's not intimidating because it is small and lightweight. I absolutely would not hesitate to recommend something like this. Now, if you have any questions about anything you've seen in the video, anything at all, pop them down in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts about this as well, because it's a very interesting thing. I've never really thought about it until we did this video, until I started researching it, and then it suddenly all started to make a lot of sense. Using Micro Four Thirds for things like macro photography. So if you have any experience of that, pop it down in the comments. I'd love to hear about that. I love hearing your stories about that kind of stuff anyway. If you like the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Make sure to subscribe as well for all kinds of new stuff. Like I say, there's a macro photography tutorial on its way. So if this is something that interests you, absolutely watch out for that. Otherwise, new tutorials every Tuesday, new reviews, new interesting insights into cool little used items that we've got as well every week. I'll see you in the next video, and as always, thanks for watching.